Hello family, welcome back to History Edge English. I'm so happy to have you here again. Feel comfortable, relax and let's get into this story. He was 39 years old. He would never turn 40. And yet the words he left behind, the marches, the speeches, the bruises on the bodies of the people who followed him, would outlive every bullet ever fired in hatred. This is the story of a man who dared to dream in a country that was still learning how to sleep. This is the story of Martin Luther King Jr. If this kind of story speaks to you, if you believe that history should be told with honesty and heart, then please take one moment right now to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Every single subscriber helps us continue bringing you stories like this one. Now, let us go back to the beginning. Atlanta, Georgia. January 15, 1929. The world was on the edge of disaster, the Great Depression was about to swallow the hopes of millions, and into this fragile world, a boy was born to Alberta and Michael King Sr., a Baptist preacher who led the congregation of Ebenezer Baptist Church with a voice that seemed to reach the ceiling of heaven itself. The boy was first named Michael, after his father. But later, inspired by the great Protestant reformer Martin Luther, the father would change both their names. The son became Martin Luther King Jr., a name that would one day echo in every language on earth. Atlanta was not kind to black children. The laws of the American South, known as Jim Crow laws, had built an entire architecture of humiliation. Black people could not drink from the same water fountains as white people, could not eat at the same lunch counters, could not ride in the front of city buses, could not vote without risking their lives. The world into which Martin was born was one in which his skin color was considered, by law and by custom, a mark of inferiority. He would spend his entire life dismantling that lie, brick by brick, march by march, word by word. Martin grew up in the sweet Auburn neighborhood of Atlanta, a community that was, despite the grinding injustice of segregation, alive with black culture, black commerce, and black faith. His grandfather, the Reverend Adam Daniel Williams, had built Ebenezer Baptist Church into one of the most respected congregations in the South. His father had then carried that church to even greater prominence. Into this world of faith and oratory, young Martin was immersed from his very first breath. He was a sensitive, serious child, the kind of boy who would read a dictionary for pleasure, who felt the pain of the world deeply and personally. At the age of 6, his white playmates told him they were no longer allowed to play with him. Their parents had forbidden it. It was Martin's first direct encounter with the wall of segregation, and his mother sat with him afterward and told him something he would repeat to audiences for the rest of his life: "You are as good as anyone." Those words were planted in him like a seed in stone. They would crack through everything. Martin Luther King Jr. was, in the most literal sense of the word, brilliant. He was so gifted academically that he skipped both 9th and 12th grade and entered Morehouse College in Atlanta at the astonishing age of 15. Morehouse was an all-black institution, a citadel of black intellectual life, and it was here that Martin began to wrestle seriously with the great questions of justice, faith, and human dignity. He read voraciously, Thoreau, Plato, Gandhi, the great theologians. And he began to understand that his father's gift for oratory and his own love of ideas might one day be weapons against an unjust world. At Morehouse, Martin was mentored by its president, Dr. Benjamin Mays, a man who spoke about faith not as passive acceptance but as active confrontation with evil. Mays believed that the black church had a responsibility to challenge injustice, not merely comfort the suffering. That belief would become the foundation of Martin's entire life's work. He graduated from Morehouse in 1948 at the age of 19 and, following in his father's footsteps, began studying theology. Martin studied at Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, one of the few integrated institutions in the country at the time, and then pursued his doctorate at Boston University. These years in the North were both liberating and clarifying. For the first time in his life, Martin moved in spaces where black and white students sat together in classrooms, debated ideas as equals, and shared meals without the shadow of Jim Crow falling across the table. And yet he knew, with a certainty that grew each year, that this integration was the exception, not the rule. His people in the South were still living under conditions that the world outside barely acknowledged. In Boston, he also found something he had not been looking for. He found Coretta Scott, a young woman from Alabama who was studying music at the New England Conservatory. Coretta was intelligent, poised, politically aware, and strikingly beautiful. Their first telephone conversation lasted so long that she told him afterward she had not expected to be so drawn in. They married in 1953. She would become not merely his wife but his partner, his conscience, and, after April 4, 1968, his grief's most dignified messenger to the world. In 1954, Martin Luther King Jr. was called to lead the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. He was 25 years old. Montgomery was one of the most rigidly segregated cities in the Deep South, a city where the laws were enforced not just by courtrooms but by violence, by the terror of the Ku Klux Klan, by a culture of racial hierarchy so deeply embedded that many white citizens simply could not conceive of the world existing any other way. Into this world came a 25-year-old preacher with a doctorate in theology and a voice that could shake walls. He was barely settled into his new home when history knocked on his door, not in the form of a great leader, but in the form of a tired woman who refused to give up her seat. On the 1st of December, 1955, Rosa Parks, a seamstress and longtime civil rights activist, was riding home on a Montgomery city bus after a long day's work. When the bus filled with white passengers and the driver demanded she give up her seat in the colored section, Rosa Parks looked at him and said no. She was arrested. She was fingerprinted. She was charged with violating the city's segregation laws. And her quiet act of defiance lit a fire that had been smoldering for decades. The black community of Montgomery mobilized with breathtaking speed. Joe and Robinson of the Women's Political Council worked through the night printing tens of thousands of flyers calling for a boycott of the city buses. And the community chose a young preacher, the new man in town, the one who hadn't yet made enough enemies to be dismissed, to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association. They chose Martin Luther King Jr. He was 26 years old. He had no idea he was stepping into the role that would define the rest of his life. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. 381 days of black citizens walking to work in the rain, in the heat, in the cold, rather than give one more cent to a system designed to humiliate them. They organized carpools. They wore out their shoe leather. They were harassed, arrested, and threatened. And through all of it, Martin stood at the pulpit of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church night after night, urging nonviolence, channeling Gandhi, reminding his congregation that their suffering was not in vain. His home was bombed. Coretta was inside with their infant daughter when the explosion ripped the front porch apart. Martin raced home to find a crowd of angry black citizens already gathered outside, many of them armed. He stood on the damaged porch and told the crowd, "We cannot solve this problem through retaliatory violence. We must meet violence with nonviolence." The crowd dispersed. The miracle was not that the bomb had not killed his family. The miracle was what he said in the aftermath. It is worth pausing here to understand what Martin Luther King Jr. actually believed, because nonviolence was not passivity. It was not fear. It was a profoundly disciplined, philosophically grounded strategy that he had studied in the writings of Mahatma Gandhi and traced back to the teachings of Jesus Christ. The idea was this, that when you refuse to strike back against violence, you expose the violence of the oppressor to the moral conscience of the watching world. You do not protect yourself from suffering. You absorb it. And in absorbing it, you reveal to all who have eyes to see that the system causing that suffering is monstrous. Martin called this redemptive suffering. It was not a comfortable idea. It demanded extraordinary courage, perhaps more courage than fighting back. To stand still while a police officer raises a baton. To walk forward while fire hoses push your body across the pavement. To march again the next morning. That was the discipline Martin demanded of the movement, and the fact that so many ordinary people found that discipline within themselves remains one of the most astonishing achievements in the history of human resistance. On November 13, 1956, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional. It was a landmark decision, the first major legal victory of the civil rights movement. On December 20, 1956, Martin Luther King Jr. and other movement leaders rode the first integrated city bus in Montgomery. He sat in the front. A white minister sat beside him. The photographs from that morning capture something rare, a man who has just seen the future arrive. But Martin knew, even as he celebrated, that Montgomery was only the beginning. The system of segregation ran across every southern state like a network of deep roots. Pulling up one was an achievement. Pulling up all of them would require something much larger, much more organized, and much more sustained. The movement needed a spine. And Martin set about building one. In January 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. helped found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, an organization designed to coordinate civil rights activities across the South, using the Black church as its institutional foundation. The church was the one institution that the system of segregation had never quite managed to destroy, the one space where Black life was wholly sovereign. The SCLC would use that space as a launching pad for organized, disciplined, nonviolent direct action. Martin was elected its first president, a position he would hold until his death. He was 28 years old. He was already, by any measure, one of the most important figures in American public life. And the threats against him were multiplying as fast as his influence. The FBI, under its director J. Edgar Hoover, had already begun monitoring him. Hoover was convinced, without evidence, that Martin was a communist, and he would spend the next decade deploying the full surveillance apparatus of the federal government against a Baptist preacher whose only weapon was the truth. In September 1958, Martin Luther King Jr. was in Harlem, New York, signing copies of his new book, an account of the Montgomery campaign called Stride Toward Freedom. A black woman named Isola Ware Curry approached the table. Without warning, she plunged a steel letter opener into his chest. The blade came to rest so close to his aorta that surgeons later told him that had he merely sneezed before they reached the blade, the pressure change could have punctured the vessel and he would have been dead within seconds. He survived. And his response, once he had recovered enough to speak, was characteristic. He expressed concern for the woman who had stabbed him. He called for prayer on her behalf. He said he harbored no bitterness. Whether one reads this as genuine saintliness or as the disciplined performance of a man who understood how his own story needed to be told, the effect was the same: it made him untouchable by any accusation of hatred. The movement could not afford a leader who hated his enemies. Martin refused to become one. In February 1959, Martin and Coretta traveled to India as guests of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, visiting the land where Mahatma Gandhi had refined the philosophy of nonviolent resistance that Martin had made the cornerstone of his own movement. The trip was deeply moving and, at times, profoundly sobering. Martin was struck by the poverty he witnessed. By the sight of suffering so vast and systemic that it reminded him that the struggle for human dignity was not merely an American story but a universal one. He returned from India more committed than ever to nonviolence, but also more aware of the connection between racial injustice and economic injustice, a connection that would grow increasingly central to his thinking in the final years of his life. In India, he had seen what it looked like when the machinery of oppression was allowed to run unchallenged for generations. He came home knowing that the clock for his own country was not unlimited. On February 1, 1960, for black college students, Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, Azell Blair Jr., and David Richmond, sat down at a whites-only lunch counter at a Woolworth store in Greensboro, North Carolina, and asked to be served. They were refused. They sat still. They were harassed, had food poured on them, were threatened with arrest. They came back the next day. And the day after that. Within weeks, the sit-in movement had spread to dozens of cities across the South. Within months, the tactic had forced the desegregation of lunch counters across the region. Martin had not initiated the sit-ins. The students had moved first, moved fast, and moved with a courage that electrified the country. But he was their most prominent champion, their strategic advisor, and a voice that translated their courage into the language of the national conscience. Later that year, students formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. And the movement gained yet another engine. The world was accelerating. The old order was beginning, ever so slowly, to crack. In October 1960, Martin was arrested at an Atlanta sit-in and sentenced to 4 months of hard labor at the Reidsville State Prison, a notoriously brutal facility. The sentence was a shock. Legal observers noted that the judge's decision was disproportionate, designed to punish and to frighten. Coretta was pregnant with their 3rd child. She was terrified. Then something unexpected happened. John F. Kennedy, in the middle of a tight presidential campaign, called Coretta to express his concern. His brother Robert Kennedy called the judge and quietly argued for Martin's release. Within days, Martin was released on bail. The black community, deeply moved by the gesture, shifted heavily toward Kennedy in the election. Kennedy won the presidency by the narrowest of margins, and many historians believe that black voters in key states made the difference. A phone call to a worried wife had changed the course of American political history. Not every campaign succeeded. In Albany, Georgia in 1961 and 1962, Martin and the SCLC launched a major desegregation drive that ultimately failed to achieve its immediate goals. The Albany police chief, Lori Pritchett, had studied the movement's tactics carefully and responded with mass arrests but without visible brutality, denying the movement the images of violent oppression that generated national outrage and political pressure. Martin was arrested twice. The campaigns produced no concrete legislative change. Albany was painful. Critics questioned Martin's leadership. Some within the movement grew frustrated. But Albany was also, in retrospect, an education. Martin and his lieutenants, among them the brilliant organizer Wyatt T. Walker and the towering strategist Ralph Abernathy, studied what had gone wrong. They identified the need for focused, specific campaigns targeted at systemic opponents who could be held publicly accountable. They needed a villain visible enough to shock the country. They found one in Birmingham. Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 was perhaps the most brutally segregated city in America. It had been bombed so many times that black residents had renamed it Bombingham. Its public safety commissioner, a man named Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor, was a ferocious defender of segregation who believed that fire hoses and police dogs were appropriate tools of crowd control. He was, for Martin's strategic purposes, exactly the kind of opponent who would reveal the true face of American racism to the watching world. Project C, for confrontation, began in April 1963. Thousands of demonstrators, including schoolchildren as young as 6 years old, marched into the streets of Birmingham. Bull Connor responded with everything he had. Fire hoses knocked bodies against concrete. Police dogs lunged at young men in their Sunday clothes. The images went around the world. They appeared on the front pages of newspapers from Tokyo to London to Moscow. The savagery was undeniable. The moral clarity was overwhelming. The Kennedy administration, which had been cautious about civil rights, was forced by the images from Birmingham to act. Martin was arrested on April 12, 1963, and placed in solitary confinement in Birmingham City Jail. White moderate clergymen published an open letter calling the demonstrations unwise and untimely and urging patience. Martin, writing in the margins of a smuggled newspaper and on scraps of paper that were smuggled out piece by piece, composed one of the most powerful pieces of political writing in American history, the letter from Birmingham jail. In it, he dismantled the logic of moderation with surgical precision. He wrote that, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He wrote that he had almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the great stumbling block to freedom was not the Ku Klux Klan but the white moderate who preferred a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. He wrote that one had a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. The letter circulated in printed form across the country, was read from pulpits, was published in magazines. It remains, 60 years later, as relevant as the day it was written. On August 28, 1963, more than 250,000 people gathered on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. It was the largest demonstration in American history to that point, organized by a coalition of civil rights organizations under the leadership of the great labor organizer A. Philip Randolph and the movement's master logistics genius, Bayard Rustin. They had organized this ocean of humanity in a matter of weeks with no internet, no smartphones, no social media. Only faith and determination. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke last. He had a prepared speech. He had delivered portions of it before. But in the moment, moved by the crowd, by the heat, by the weight of what was happening, the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson called out to him from behind the podium, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." And he set aside his written text and let the words come from some deeper place inside him, the place where the preacher and the prophet meet. The speech he delivered that afternoon has been dissected, memorized, translated, and broadcast 10,000 times, and still it retains its power because the power was never in the words alone, it was in the man who had earned the right to say them, who had been bombed and stabbed and jailed and surveilled and threatened, and who still, standing before the nation, chose hope. He spoke of a dream in which the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slaveholders might one day sit down together at the table of brotherhood. He spoke of wanting his 4 little children to one day live in a nation where they would be judged not by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. He closed with the image of freedom ringing, from every mountainside, from every corner of the nation. Until the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, would be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last." The crowd was silent for a half-second after he finished. And then it erupted. And the sound of it was like a country waking up. The momentum from Birmingham, from the March on Washington, and from the growing national conscience pressed Congress toward action. President Kennedy had proposed sweeping civil rights legislation in June 1963. He was assassinated in November of that year, before the bill could pass. His successor, President Lyndon B. Johnson, a Texas politician who understood the levers of congressional power better than almost any president in history, took Kennedy's bill and drove it through every obstacle with relentless force. On July 2, 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. It prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in employment, public accommodations, and federally assisted programs. Martin was in the room when Johnson signed the bill. He was given one of the pens. He was 35 years old. 3 months later, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The youngest person to receive it at that time. He donated the entire prize money, $54,000, to the civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act had addressed public accommodations and employment. But the right of black citizens to vote remained, in much of the South, a brutal fiction. In Selma, Alabama, black citizens who tried to register to vote were met with impossible literacy tests, exorbitant poll taxes, and the constant threat of economic ruin or physical violence. The Dallas County Voter League had been trying to register black voters in Selma for years with almost no success. Martin and the SCLC came to Selma in January 1965 to make it a national issue. What happened on March 7, 1965, a day that would come to be known as Bloody Sunday, was an atrocity that the entire country watched on television. 600 marchers set out to walk the 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery to demand voting rights. As they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state troopers and county posse men attacked them with clubs and tear gas. The images, particularly of the young activist John Lewis, his skull fractured, lying bleeding on the bridge, provoked a national outcry. President Johnson addressed Congress 8 days later and declared, "We shall overcome." Martin led a second march on March 9 that turned back at the bridge after a federal injunction. A federal judge subsequently ordered that the march proceed with protection. On March 21, 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. and thousands of marchers set out again across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, this time protected by federalized National Guard troops. They walked for 5 days. They arrived in Montgomery, the city where 10 years earlier a tired woman on a bus had started all of this, on March 25, 1965. 25,000 people gathered at the Alabama state capitol. On August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. It was the most significant expansion of black voting rights since the 15th Amendment. Martin was again in the room. The arc of the moral universe, he had once said, was long, but it bent toward justice. In the space of a decade, he and the people who walked with him had bent it further and faster than anyone had dared believe possible. Behind the public triumphs, a campaign of psychological warfare was being waged against Martin Luther King Jr. by the Federal Bureau of Investigation under J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover despised Martin with an intensity that has puzzled historians ever since, a venom rooted, perhaps, in racism, in institutional defensiveness, in the fear of a man who could move millions without institutional authority. The FBI wiretapped Martin's phones, bugged his hotel rooms, and accumulated files on his private life that ran to thousands of pages. In November 1964, the FBI sent Martin a letter so vicious that when it was finally declassified and published decades later, it shocked even those who already knew about the Bureau's surveillance program. The letter, along with a recording made from one of Martin's bugged hotel rooms, implied that Martin should end his life before the letter's contents were made public. It was, by any reading, an attempt to drive a man to suicide. Martin's aides believe Coretta was the first to read it. She told Martin. He was devastated. And then he went back to work. In 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. made the most ambitious and, ultimately, most painful gamble of his career. He moved the civil rights movement north, to Chicago, to demonstrate that racism was not merely a Southern pathology but a national disease. The Chicago campaign targeted housing segregation, the system by which black residents were confined by economic pressure and active discrimination to overcrowded, underserved neighborhoods while the rest of the city remained white by design. What he encountered in Chicago shook him. When he led a march through the all-white neighborhood of Marquette Park, the crowd that greeted the marchers threw bottles and bricks and wielded Confederate flags. Martin later said it was the most hatred he had ever witnessed, more venomous, in its raw ugliness, than anything he had encountered in Alabama. The Chicago campaign ended without the clear legislative victory of Birmingham or Selma. Mayor Richard Daley was too politically skilled to provide the kind of brutal imagery that had generated national outrage in the South. Martin went home from Chicago knowing that the easy victories were over. On April 4, 1967, exactly 1 year before his assassination, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech at Riverside Church in New York City that many of his closest advisors had begged him not to give. He called it, Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence. In it, he came out in clear, unambiguous opposition to the Vietnam War, calling the American government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, and linking the war to the poverty and racism he had spent his life fighting. The backlash was ferocious. President Johnson, whose Great Society programs had been crucial allies in the civil rights struggle, felt personally betrayed. The mainstream press savaged him. The NAACP issued a statement distancing itself from his anti-war position. Even some of his closest allies privately questioned the wisdom of the move. Martin's response was serene and clear. A man who had committed his life to the proposition that all human beings possessed equal dignity could not remain silent while his government sent disproportionately black soldiers to die in a war he believed to be unjust. Conscience, he said, was not negotiable. In the final year of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. was planning what he believed would be the boldest campaign of his career. He called it the Poor People's Campaign, a multiracial coalition of the economically marginalized that would converge on Washington, D.C., erect a tent city on the Mall, and remain there until Congress passed meaningful economic legislation, a guaranteed annual income, full employment, and an end to the economic conditions that kept millions of Americans, Black, white, Native American, Latino, in permanent poverty. The campaign reflected a deepening in his thinking that some of his supporters found unsettling. He was no longer speaking only about the dignity of Black Americans. He was speaking about the economic structure of American life itself, about a system that he believed was fundamentally organized to concentrate wealth at the top and deny dignity at the bottom. He was moving from civil rights to human rights, from desegregation to economic justice. The FBI's file on him grew thicker with each speech. And the threats on his life multiplied. In the final year of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. was planning what he believed would be the boldest campaign of his career. He called it the Poor People's Campaign, a multiracial coalition of the economically marginalized that would converge on Washington, D.C., erect a tent city on the Mall, and remain there until Congress passed meaningful economic legislation, a guaranteed annual income, full employment, and an end to the economic conditions that kept millions of Americans, Black, white, Native American, Latino, in permanent poverty. The campaign reflected a deepening in his thinking that some of his supporters found unsettling. He was no longer speaking only about the dignity of Black Americans. He was speaking about the economic structure of American life itself, about a system that he believed was fundamentally organized to concentrate wealth at the top and deny dignity at the bottom. He was moving from civil rights to human rights, from desegregation to economic justice. The FBI's file on him grew thicker with each speech. And the threats on his life multiplied. On the night of April 3, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. stood at the podium of Mason Temple in Memphis in the middle of a thunderstorm. He had nearly not come, he was exhausted, emotionally depleted, and had initially sent Ralph Abernathy to speak in his place. But the crowd was large and the moment was urgent, and so he came. What he said that night has become, in retrospect, perhaps the most haunting speech in American history, haunting because it reads like a man who knew what was coming. He told the congregation he was not worried about anything anymore, that he was not fearing any man. He said that God had allowed him to go up to the mountain, and that he had looked over, and that he had seen the promised land. He said he might not get there with them, but he wanted them to know that night that they, as a people, would get to the promised land. The crowd rose to its feet. He stepped back from the podium, his face wet with tears. He sat down. He did not know it was his last speech. But the words sounded, and have always sounded, like a goodbye. The following evening, April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was standing on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel, room 306, getting ready for dinner with friends. He was in good spirits. He was joking with the musicians below about what songs they would play that night. A colleague urged him to get a coat, the evening air had a chill. He turned to say something across the balcony. And then the world changed forever. A single rifle shot fired from the bathroom window of a rooming house across the street struck him in the right side of his face. He fell backward. His tie was nearly torn from his neck by the impact. His aides rushed to him. Ralph Abernathy knelt beside him and held his hand. A military commander who happened to be present pressed a white towel to the wound. Jesse Jackson, standing in the parking lot below, ran up to the balcony and cradled Martin's head. The ambulance came. But the doctors at St. Joseph's Hospital were never able to close the distance between a bullet and the aorta. At 7:05 p.m., Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. The riots that followed in more than 100 American cities, the fires and the grief and the rage, were, in their own terrible way, a testament to how deeply his loss was felt by the people he had given his life to serve. President Johnson declared a national day of mourning. Coretta Scott King, with a grace that defied description, led the march in Memphis that Martin had come back to lead, for days after her husband's murder. She walked with her children. She walked without tears. She walked because the movement could not stop. James Earl Ray, a white fugitive, was arrested 2 months later at London's Heathrow Airport and eventually confessed to the killing, though he later recanted, and the full truth of whether he acted alone has been debated ever since. Martin Luther King Jr. was buried in Atlanta at Southview Cemetery, later moved to a crypt beside the Ebenezer Baptist Church where his father had preached and where he himself had first heard the voice of God speaking through human throats. His epitaph came from the old Negro spiritual he had quoted in Washington 5 summers earlier, "Free at last. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last." What he left behind cannot be measured only in laws. Though the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act are monuments enough, he left behind a method, the proof that ordinary people, armed with conscience and courage and the willingness to absorb suffering without retaliation, could move the most powerful nation on earth. He left behind a standard by which every generation since has been forced to measure itself. He left behind the dream. Not as a comfortable fantasy but as a demand, an obligation, an unfinished architecture that his country is still, all these decades later, being asked to complete. He was a man who knew he would probably be killed. He said so, in speech after speech, in the years before Memphis. And he got on the plane anyway. He went to the march anyway. He stood on the balcony anyway. And that, more than any speech, more than any prize, more than any law, is the thing that makes Martin Luther King Jr. irreplaceable. Not that he had no fear, but that he walked straight through it, every single day, for the rest of his short and extraordinary life.